This debate is proudly brought to you by the Department of Economic Development, KwaZulu Natal.
Welcome back. We're coming to you live from the International Investment and Entrepreneurship Conference in Durban. Gentlemen, let's pick up on the debate that we started before the break, brought to the table by Matthew Lester, and that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRICS. We're at the table. We've got a voice. Are we having the opportunity, or do we now have the opportunity, to change the international game?
I think it's a fantastic platform for South Africa to be on. I don't think we actually, let me not say this the wrong way, would have otherwise deserved to be there. It is through our own vigor that we got ourselves onto that platform. Something which I believe we lack as a culture in South Africa is a greater communication between government and business. We tend to speak across to each other, whereas when you go to places like China, they sit in the same rooms, they talk about a singular strategy, and then they know what private sector has to do and what public has to do. That is the one thing I would really, really cry out for, a stronger dialogue between government and business.
Doesn't it highlight the go-getter mentality on the continent, specifically in South Africa, MEC, that we did have the vigor to get ourselves into the BRICS?
Well, I'm sure my view would slightly differ with Andile, and I say we are in that table because we are a deserving party to be there on behalf of the continent. And however, I say that for us, it's a perfect platform, as I think he has indicated. A platform that allows us, first and foremost, to be able to say, by being part of BRICS and this being part of the developing and emerging markets, we think it is important that for our own entrepreneurs to be able to have access into some of these markets. We are talking about a 1.1 billion population in India. We're talking about 1.3 billion, close to 1.4 billion population in China. And for us, it is perfectly important that if some of South Africa's entrepreneurs are able to capture even a 0.5% of that market share in China, it's a phenomenal point for growth for South Africa and South Africans. And for us, we think we should utilize this not only for South Africa, and that is what I think is important. We go there with a 50 million population. What we need to bring behind us is the region, to 257 million. If we can actually therefore ensure that that region, with the integration, we are able to maximize and utilize the benefit for the region as a whole, we then can actually get much more value out of it than ordinarily when South Africa is there on its own.
MEC, just before we move off the BRICS topic, have we been given the mandate from the rest of Africa to be the continent's voice when it comes to the BRICS?
Well, the point of departure is we are there to put Africa's interest, and it is no doubt that South Africa's strength and South Africa's influence in the multilateral fora generally across the world has indicated that if we can be able to argue for the interest, you would remember that at the establishment, the formation of the AU, we therefore argued for NIPAD, and it was led by a South African president on behalf of the AU. We think we must also still be able to say for South Africa's reawakening, it is important that the platform that we get on behalf of the continent as an African country, we are not there for our own and for our sake, we are there for the continent. We must open opportunities for the continent.
Matthew, I'm going to put the same question to you. Do you believe that South Africa's voice is representative of the African continent?
I'm going to throw a different tack on that. I think if you look at the leaders that we've got at the moment, I think they are representing Africa. If you watch the likes of Gordon, if you watch the likes of Manuel, and also Zuma for that matter, they're out there batting for Africa. It's there on the platform. It's happening whether it's accepted or not. They are doing the job. It can't be doing us any harm. So I think, yeah, we must carry on. And there will, of course, always be critics.
And the pressure we're seeing for the next head of the International Monetary Fund to come now from the BRICS, do you think that's a reality? We could take center stage?
I don't feel in a good position to predict what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. I think everybody's going to watch with a great amount of interest.
Watch this space. Let's move on now to the banking environment in South Africa. We recently had the banking regulator coming out and saying that the banking system, particularly in South Africa, is very healthy. However, bad debts are troubling those loan books and costs are rising. Obviously, the financial sector is crucial to the economic awakening of the African continent. We want stability in South Africa if that is the gateway to the rest of the continent. Andile.
We shouldn't be surprised by that. We've come through a global economic crisis. Everybody else is reeling. Countries are being bailed out. If you were not reading those headlines and you just simply looked at the graphs, what we are going through, you could just simply think was cyclical. At this time of the cycle, bad debts do grow, and they do hold back on what the banks can do. That's the major problem. The bad debts belong to the banks, and it's the bank's problem. The problem for the country and the economy is that banks are not going to be extending new credit when the old credit or is going bad or is not being serviced. So yes, those are certainly issues, but I would argue that we don't need structural intervention in order to get it out of the way. If it was a bigger problem, we always have other tools such as fiscal policy and monetary policy, which can assist if the economy is just simply not getting through that glut.
And Colin, I think you're more than overqualified to comment on this front.
Well, I'll give you a slightly different angle. I think the fact is right now that the South African banks have surplus liquidity, and if you look at the capital ratios, they're very well capitalized. Now, this is very good news in many respects for the development of corporate and medium-sized enterprises going forward who have high-quality assets to offer the banks. So, for example, we haven't really touched on the question of private equity and the role of private equity as well as public equity. I did mention earlier that South Africa has one of the most sophisticated financial markets in the African continent and is going to be, to all intents and purposes, factually, the capital market corridor to the African continent for the international investing community. So the question is, outside of the traded markets, the equity and the debt markets, is there a role for private equity in helping those countries like in Angola that doesn't have a stock exchange, or Nigeria where there is a stock exchange but it's not particularly liquid or deep, other countries to capitalize good opportunities and to get good investment working. And the fact is, I think private equity has a very important role to play. So you've seen a lot of new funds being developed, the likes of Actis, Ethos, Carlyle recently, one of the major private equity firms in the world, established a South African presence, so on and so forth. And the fact is, the banking system links with this because, in effect, what they do is they provide debt into the capital structures for these investments that are going to take place, led by the private equity firms. And so you have a situation where, re-emerging, you have the possibility of leverage buyouts, you have the possibility of good assets effectively being funded by a banking system that's looking for good assets. And this is a very good dynamic that's in the market at the moment.
We also need to touch on cross-border trade. The Premier of KwaZulu Natal, in his morning address, is saying that that is one of the key elements that we have to address. The fact that trade is not done easily across the African continent between African countries. Now, gentlemen, I remember hosting a debate at the World Economic Forum in 2006. That was on the agenda. We're still debating it. When do we see resolution to cross-border trade on the African continent, MEC?
Well, this is going to become a process. It can't be just an event. But I think from where we stand, for instance, as KwaZulu Natal, we have actually put our own money where our mouth is. We have invested in the Dubai Trade Port, and we have just actually concluded a memorandum of understanding between ourselves and one of the national airlines, Comair. Part of this is to actually open the routes into Africa, where we will now be flying to Nairobi in Kenya, to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, to Harare in Zimbabwe, to Lusaka, Zambia, to Maputo in Mozambique, and to Luanda in Angola. The intention here is not only to have passenger throughput that goes into there, but it's to open up air freight capability. We have positioned ourselves to become the hub in terms of air freight. The fact that we actually have got our own air freight that we manage as a province of KwaZulu Natal, it means we now can easily penetrate into the region. Now, of course, here I'm dealing with at a small scale in terms of time-sensitive goods, and we're not talking about many other goods. But from the port side, we're actually moving to making Durban as a hub port. so that it can be linked with some of the bigger ports in the world, and therefore you can be able to have your big ships offloading here and some of the smaller ships taking up into Africa, into South America, as well as to Europe. Now, you definitely need to develop the infrastructure between the countries in Africa and in the region. And that is the issue which is on the table, and there's a ministerial committee in the region that is looking at this matter and how to address it. We will use, of course, the diplomatic channels to influence the pace in which we move in terms of infrastructure development in that regard.
Well, Matthew, it certainly sounds as though the pace is being accelerated. That is execution.
Yeah, you know, there's a hell of a difference between writing out a memorandum of understanding or passing a new law and putting in the infrastructure to deal with it. That infrastructure is going to take 10 years. And we can all say we're going to do all of these wonderful things to do, which unofficially happens. We are trading more with our partners. But we have a huge backlog, particularly on road and rail. And there's still a long way to go. But cheer up. Look at what we've achieved in the last 10 years. It's
Are we
a good
coming
start.
back to the backlog that the Public Enterprises Minister, Gigaba, referred to, the 1.5 trillion rand backlog in infrastructure?
Well, that's again, you know, we have to accept that I think they did the right thing. Get to the new South Africa, turn the expenditure tap off, take stock of the whole situation and understand it. That took 10 years before you could even get to starting it. We've only been on building infrastructure properly now, effectively since we got the World Cup announcement. So it's early days yet.
Andile, this has probably been a key debating point for you on many panels over the years. Are you starting to see traction on the ground? Of course, you again travel extensively on the African continent.
Definitely so. The companies that Colin mentioned in his keynote address, the ShopRites and the like, the MTNs demonstrate that if you go and put your feet on the ground, you can make things happen. It's not always easy, but you certainly can make things happen. The fact that we talk about trade is important. It's probably the single most important thing in any economy. We'll always talk about trade. The Chinese and the Americans will never stop talking about trade. The major issue, though, still comes back to that of infrastructure. If you have the roads, if you have the ports, if you have the rail lines, then trade can take place. When you don't have those things, you're then inhibiting trade. So as long as those are getting sorted out, the political agendas and everything else will continue to follow its normal course, where each country is going to try its best to look after its vested interest.
Coming back to the topic at hand, is Africa ready for an economic reawakening? We would be remiss if we didn't mention health and health-related services across the African continent as certainly a glaring hole. Colin, your thoughts?
Well, it's an interesting question you ask, because intuitively you would think that the private health operators, for example, the Discoveries of the world, the Netcares and so on and so forth, should have a market in Africa which would be very conducive and very receptive. Many of these companies, however, are looking at other emerging markets, not necessarily Africa. And rather the services industry, so telecommunication services, of which MTN and their foray into Nigeria, extremely successful, is a very good case in point. Or Standard Bank into the African continent, who've been very successful in expanding in the African continent, are examples where that's taking place. So there is a very good question to ask: why is it that the health sector is a relatively orphan sector and more difficult for the industry to execute? Obviously, back home, South Africa's health industry has a lot to deal with, and the fact is that as the emerging middle class comes into being, and they emerge into the mainstream of the economy, that is, feeding the customer bases of many of these private health insurers or private hospitals, as the public sector finds it difficult to accommodate those individuals. And so I think there's a dynamic there which is unresolved, and it's a curious one to monitor.
Couldn't this be the Achilles heel where the African continent is concerned? And Richard Branson recently quoted as saying, the most important thing in life is life.
We fully concur with that. The most important thing is life. And that's for this reason what our approach that we have adopted in South Africa is to say the issue of universal access to adequate health services is quite important. And hence, therefore, that the government and the leading party, the majority party, took a decision that we must talk about the question of universal access, and the issue, therefore, of the National Health Insurance Scheme came as a result of that. And I think if we actually compare ourselves with some of the well-developed countries in the world, then you actually see the problem that has actually been going on in the US, which actually then led to President Obama to actually come up with a new bill. It's now history. We all now know what happened after it on that one. And the problem that have taken place as well in the UK, generally speaking, of long waiting period for people to have access. We think these are matters that we have been very worried about. And for that, we think South Africa has actually taken this very firm decision that we will have space for public institutions to provide adequate health services, but we must also allow for private sector to have space in that regard. But the issue fundamentally that we must all of us answer is that we must therefore be able to give universal access, that a poor person should have an equal opportunity to have good health services like any person who either in the middle class or in the upper class.
National health insurance, is that the solution?
Well, it's going to be a big one, and we're going to see the first round of it next year in the budget. They say it's going to take 14 years to come in, so please don't hold your breath that you're going to get everything that you want from the 1st of March next year. But what you've got to possibly put in with this is it's a symptom of a broader subject, which is the relationship with labor over this whole thing. Because when you open up national health, you're immediately going to have COSATU jumping in and saying, no, you must do it this way, or you've got to do it that way. So it's an overall thing that, you've got to look at national health, the relationship between employer and employee. Who's going to pay for this? It's all very well we're going to say it's going to happen, but at the moment, we're spending 110 billion rands a year, or 18% of the total national budget for a mess. It's a long way to come back, and it is a threat to the general stability of the whole thing. We cannot carry on like this.
Andile, add your voice to the national health insurance debate.
It's crucial. Of one of the three reasons why poor people remain poor, why does poverty exist? Healthcare or lack of healthcare is one of them. So it's a non-negotiable. It just simply has to be done.
But is NHI the solution?
It has to be the solution. In one way or another, you have to find a way in which you're going to accommodate everybody. The point is, it's going to take us more than a decade to get there. The money which was put aside in this budget was to spend on thinking about what is the best way to think about how we're going to get there. That's how far away we actually are. So to sit here today and say, yes, this is the right way, no, it's the wrong way, ideologically, yes, it is the right thing to say, we as a country will have a system that ensures that everybody has got access to decent healthcare. That's the right thing to do, but it's very difficult to know how we're going to get there.
MEC, are you confident about the execution of national health insurance?
I'm definitely confident, and probably I would say so primarily because in government where we discuss some of these matters, I know that it's not just an issue of commitment. It's an issue of saying, of course, when you're actually starting something as big like this, you want to ensure that all your processes are in place, that you have got the best expert information, and that you look for the best way of putting together the appropriate deal. And in that regard, it was necessary that we actually spend resources and time to ensure that we don't take a jump into something that we have not carefully think of. But at an ideological level, the issue of universal access to health services is fundamental. It goes to the heart of our Constitution. And that's why I said I agreed with Bronwyn when he says the importance of life is life itself.
Colin, you signaled you wanted to take this further.
No, I believe that we've got to get the basics right. We can't wait 14 years to fix the basics. And we don't need a radical transformation in the system to get teachers to schools on time, to get principals at school, making sure that the number of days taught is the number of days taught. Same in the hospitals, that the beds are clean, the nurses are there on time, the managers are doing their job, and the investment that's being made is getting the output required. That's the starting point, and I think in the next 14 years we get that right, then everybody will be much better in a much better frame of mind for debating what the national health insurance solution should be.
I want to go back to what the Premier of KwaZulu Natal tabled earlier today, that two essential elements are foreign direct investment, encouraging foreign direct investment onto the African continent, and secondly, encouraging cross-border trade. Now we enter into the equation North Africa, and the headlines that we've been making on the international stage as a result of the political turmoil unfolding across Northern Africa. Where to from here?
Look, it's very difficult for us to sit in the south and look up north and say this is the way it should be or shouldn't be. What probably underpins it, though, is that it is important to have democracy entrenched in a nation.
But isn't it the sentiment? It may be north, and we're in the south, but it's the African continent.
I think possibly a number of years ago, the international investor was not that discerning. The experience that we have on the ground is that the international investor is quite astute and can differentiate from country to region down to a company level. And they'll argue with you over the EBITDA levels for a local bank versus a bank sitting in China. So I shouldn't think that's a worry for the professional investors, no.
So we've got a sophisticated international investor, is what Andile is saying. Is that the reality?
No, I think that is true, and I think the more that people disaggregate what Africa is, and they say South Africa is the leading capital market, strong managers, good companies, predictable constitution, Angola's an oil economy that's doing extremely well coming out of a war, establishing itself. Nigeria is leading the West African region, a big population, massive consumer opportunity, democratizing the banking system, doing extremely well. Kenya is becoming a hub for an East African revitalization around Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, very exciting developments. And North Africa is there, and it's got a democratization process happening that's very important. At the end of the day, when people look at the large, you do your desktop analysis, the large countries in Africa are going to be Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. Those are the three places. And the fact that Egypt and Nigeria have gone through massive democratization processes can only be positive for the continent.
We've got 5 minutes left, gentlemen, for this live broadcast. There are two elements still to discuss. One is the health of South Africa's economy in light of the GDP numbers coming out yesterday. First quarter GDP at 4.8%. Surprising on the upside. I think consensus figures were around about 4.2%. Matthew, I know you've done some work on this. And then the second element we need to touch on is KZN's role in developing the African continent. Matthew, if you can start with GDP growth.
GDP growth is 4.8 according to Prof and Gordon. That's against your national budget for the year, which is based on a 3.4% growth rate. So that means it's ticking along very nicely. You even had Prof and Gordon joking about it. He doesn't do that very nice. So that's, you know, that's absolutely super. But bring it down to grassroots Durban today. Here we are in the province with the biggest population in South Africa, nearly 20% of the total population, contributing 13% of the tax to the total pot. And what we've got to say is it's absolutely critical that we've got to get Natal better and stronger for all South Africans to achieve. And then we've got to move on and do the same thing in the Eastern Cape, so that we can't be sort of relying on our Dubai that is Gauteng at the moment, because that Gauteng's producing those numbers. And that's why it's so important that we've got to get people out there and say, how can we get this inward investment into South Africa? Because government's got its own other things that it's got to go and sort out using that 4.8% growth rate and its tax base. And this is where business has got such a huge contribution to make. It's a huge challenge.
MEC?
Well, I think it is important that first and foremost we want to say that we are very grateful with the 4.8% growth in the first quarter. It was far above expectation. But for us going forward, there is no doubt that if we are going to deal with the huge levels of poverty and squalor and other challenges that we have, we will have to be very happy with the double digits. The fact that you see others growing at 8 and 9% would be much, much more happy with that. However, I think we are very grateful that we have actually turned the corner quickly. Come back to KwaZulu Natal. Yes, we think the reason why we are focusing in an international conference of this magnitude, because we believe there is space for us to grow. And therefore, I would agree with Mr. Lester on that regard, that we think part of the reason why we've been investing in infrastructure and entities like the DTP is because we really want to actually seize the opportunity presented by the potential that we have as a province of KwaZulu Natal. In that regard, we think going forward, KZN's contribution to GDP should actually at least be consummate to about 20% or so, which is the population that we have. We want to see to grow even much more bigger than that. And therefore, we've got strategies of how we can go there But we think the state can be just one player. We want to simply say there is space for entrepreneurs both inside the province, but also people outside of the province to come and invest and ensure that our contribution mirrors our perfect status.
Colin, is KZN on your investment radar screen?
Well, I think insofar as it's an important part of South Africa, yes. The important contributor, I think the defining characteristic, as far as I see it, is, and as a Joburg boy, I love KwaZulu Natal. But I would say there's two ways we think about it. One is an infrastructure hub, which feeds trade. And in my analysis, I think there's more that can be done to attract private investment interest into the port system, into the rail system, and to moving goods system, also surrounding the natural resources and mining space. And I think more can be done in that. The second thing, of course, is tourism. And KwaZulu Natal has done a fantastic job in promoting itself as a tourism destination. I do think that the Premier's point earlier, that if you actually analyze the World Cup statistics of the number of visitors that came, I think roughly half of the World Cup visitors were from Africa and half from outside Africa. And that's an important statistic, because if we can keep that momentum in African visitors, KwaZulu Natal is going to benefit a lot.
And I think it's appropriate that we give the KZN boy the final word on the panel. Mr. Mazwai, you've got 30 seconds to sum up.
I think it probably is a lovely place to close up, because so much of what we're talking about does come to this. KwaZulu Natal does have, in its very center and its core, the trading center. You've got the ports, you've got the airport. When those work and they work well, and you reduce those lag times, it's not just about the province, it's about Transnet, and they do need to work together. When you can get bulk goods out of the inland through our ports onto ships and moving, if that is a priority for the province, then it certainly is going to benefit, because it does compete with other ports within South Africa as well as our neighboring countries.
Andile, Matthew, MEC, Colin, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for watching. That's it from the International Investment and Entrepreneurship Conference in Durban.